So where would you like to start?
Let's start with Maple Groves.
All right. Do I look at the camera or do I look at you?
You can look at me.
Okay. Well, Maple Groves is a small Canadian town in northern Ontario. It has a population of around 2,000 residents. From the outside, it looks like your typical idyllic community, but since the mid-90s, it's been plagued by a series of brutal and grisly murders.
And who do you think was responsible for these murders?
Well, I don't have to think. I know that the person responsible is Rick Crow, a serial killer who is also known as the Bonesetter. It's a bit difficult to pinpoint exactly when the Bonesetter murders began because Maple Groves has a surprisingly high amount of missing person cases going back all the way to 1977. Though the first case, which I know to share the MO of the Bonesetter murders, happened in autumn of 1994. 17-year-old Thomas Becker was walking his girlfriend home, 16-year-old Allison Rose, after eating at a local diner with a few of their friends. After their meal, they separated themselves from the rest of the group, wanting to spend a bit of time alone. Instead of going straight home, they apparently walked a trail in a wooded area close to Allison's home. This wooded area would later be confirmed by police to be a place where most teenagers in the town would sometimes frequent to drink or smoke or do other types of things that they can't do at home. And Allison's friends would also corroborate that the young couple would sometimes go there after school to fool around. Unfortunately, this time their evening would end in tragedy. Both their bodies were found the next morning by a man walking his dog. Thomas Becker's spine had been broken. His face was crushed as if it had been stuck between a vice. And as for Allison Rose, her leg was crushed. Her arm was broken in 3 places. Her neck was snapped. Her head had been forcibly twisted 180 degrees. Allison's watch, which had been gifted to her just the previous summer by her boyfriend to commemorate their 1-year anniversary, was broken. It was stuck at what the coroner would later confirm to be the time of her death, 7 p.m. The coroner's report indicated that, to the best of his abilities, he surmised that all that damage, those broken bones, was done not by an animal, but by a rather large man. A man who would have needed to have incredible strength to do all this with only his bare hands. 3 days passed, and just as the citizens of Maple Groves began thinking that, as tragic as these killings were, perhaps they were just an isolated event, then there was another killing. 47-year-old William Barnes was out building a gazebo in his backyard. At 6:45, his wife remembers stepping outside and shouting at him that his supper was getting cold. He brushed her off, saying he'd be inside soon. 20 minutes later, his wife returned and found him dead, lying in a pool of his own blood. 3 of his bones were broken, another 4 were cracked. His skull had been bashed in with his own hammer, a hammer which had been left at the crime scene. His wife told police when they arrived that she'd seen a face. "There was a man staring at me from the woods behind my home," she said. "An evil face." She sat down with a sketch artist to explain what she saw. This is important because, even all these decades later, that would be the only known time that someone saw the Bonesetter's face. After that, his few fortunate survivors described the man as wearing a black mask. The murder of Mr. Barnes led officers to search deeper into the woods that surrounded Maple Groves, and it was during this search that they found a makeshift shelter in the forest. It was vacant now, but it was clear that someone had been hunting and living there. When crime scene investigators began their sweep of the area, they were shocked at what they found. The investigators dug up a total of 17 bodies scattered around the shelter. Once carbon dated, some of the skeletal remains proved to be over 20 years old. It appeared that all those people who'd gone missing around Maple Groves had finally been found. Which raised the question, could these new murders be only the most recent out of a string of brutal serial killings dating all the way back to the late 1970s? And that was when the nickname of the Bonesetter began circulating. Yes, because of his method of killing, which seemed to be breaking his victims' bones, but also because he seemed to strike at 7 p.m. Let me explain the connection. The town of Maple Groves has a prominent Francophone community, and in French-Canadian folklore, there is an entity called the Bonesetter, which loosely translates to the 7 o'clock man. It's basically their version of a boogeyman. A man usually described as wearing a hat, a cape, and who walked with a cane. He also carried a sack and would go around kidnapping any children who were still outside at 7 o'clock. It was really just a story given to children in order to frighten them enough to respect their curfews or their bedtimes. There is a theory which suggests that this mythological person actually sprang from the Bonesetter. You see, a long time ago, if someone had a dislocated shoulder, let's say, they might call a Bonesetter. He would come to your house and set your bone back into place. This would obviously be quite painful. The screams of the parents as the Bonesetter would go to work would no doubt scare the children. So, when they misbehaved, the parents could threaten to call the Bonesetter to quiet them down. This would have trickled down to the French community and morphed into words that were more familiar to them, French words, and thus the Bonesetter became the Bonhomme Setter. In the peaceful town of Maple Groves during the mid-1990s, the name would be reused, given to an unknown assailant who threatened their safety. And thus a dark legend began. The police were baffled, the residents of Maple Groves were scared, but what no one in the town knew at the time was that, as ghastly as those exhumed corpses might have been, and as barbaric as the new string of murders were, they would be nothing compared to the horrific events which lay ahead.